This is a CBS News special report. President Clinton's address from the Oval Office at the White House. From CBS News headquarters in New York, here is Dan Rather.
Good evening. President Clinton is about to address the nation from the Oval Office at the White House. The president will be trying to convince a skeptical American public and Congress about the need to send about 20,000 U.S. troops to help oversee the Bosnian peace accords. Those troops would make up roughly 1/3 of a NATO force assigned to implement the peace agreement reached last week in Dayton, Ohio. The president spent the day at the White House rewriting an address that's been described as the toughest and most important of his presidency. Over the past several days, the president and his aides have been arguing forcefully about the need for the biggest U.S. military operation since the Persian Gulf War. Earlier today, the president said the people of Bosnia have suffered, quote, unspeakable atrocities. He said a lasting peace is at hand because of the Ohio Pact, and now it's up to the American people to see it through. Republican leaders in Congress remain to be convinced. Immediately after the president's address, we'll talk live with Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole. Now, here's the president.
Good evening. Last week, the warring factions in Bosnia reached a peace agreement. As a result of our efforts in Dayton, Ohio, and the support of our European and Russian partners. Tonight, I want to speak with you about implementing the Bosnian peace agreement and why our values and interests as Americans require that we participate. Let me say at the outset, America's role will not be about fighting a war. It will be about helping the people of Bosnia to secure their own peace agreement. Our mission will be limited, focused, and under the command of an American general. In fulfilling this mission, we will have the chance to help stop the killing of innocent civilians, especially children, and at the same time, to bring stability to Central Europe, a region of the world that is vital to our national interests. It is the right thing to do. From our birth, America has always been more than just a place. America has embodied an idea that has become the ideal for billions of people throughout the world. Our founders said it best. America is about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In this century especially, America has done more than simply stand for these ideals. We have acted on them and sacrificed for them. Our people fought 2 world wars so that freedom could triumph over tyranny. After World War I, we pulled back from the world, leaving a vacuum that was filled by the forces of hatred. After World War II, we continued to lead the world. We made the commitments that kept the peace, that helped to spread democracy, that created unparalleled prosperity, and that brought victory in the Cold War. Today, because of our dedication, America's ideals, liberty, democracy, and peace, are more and more the aspirations of people everywhere in the world. It is the power of our ideas, even more than our size, our wealth, and our military might, that makes America a uniquely trusted nation. With the Cold War over, some people now question the need for our continued active leadership in the world. They believe that, much like after World War I, America can now step back from the responsibilities of leadership. They argue that to be secure, we need only to keep our own borders safe, and that the time has come now to leave to others the hard work of leadership beyond our borders. I strongly disagree. As the Cold War gives way to the global village, our leadership is needed more than ever because problems that start beyond our borders can quickly become problems within them. We're all vulnerable to the organized forces of intolerance and destruction, terrorism, ethnic, religious, and regional rivalries, the spread of organized crime, and weapons of mass destruction and drug trafficking. Just as surely as fascism and communism, these forces also threaten freedom and democracy, peace and prosperity, and they too demand American leadership. But nowhere has the argument for our leadership been more clearly justified than in the struggle to stop or prevent war and civil violence, from Iraq to Haiti, from South Africa to Korea, from the Middle East to Northern Ireland. We have stood up for peace and freedom because it's in our interest to do so and because it is the right thing to do. Now, that doesn't mean we can solve every problem. My duty as president is to match the demands for American leadership to our strategic interest and to our ability to make a difference. America cannot and must not be the world's policeman. We cannot stop all war for all time, but we can stop some wars. We cannot save all women and all children, but we can save many of them. We can't do everything, but we must do what we can. There are times and places where our leadership can mean the difference between peace and war, and where we can defend our fundamental values as a people and serve our most basic strategic interests. My fellow Americans, in this new era, there are still times when America and America alone can and should make the difference for peace. The terrible war in Bosnia is such a case. Nowhere today is the need for American leadership more stark or more immediate than in Bosnia. For nearly 4 years, a terrible war has torn Bosnia apart. Horrors we prayed had been banished from Europe forever have been seared into our minds again. Skeletal prisoners caged behind barbed wire fences. Women and girls raped as a tool of war. Defenseless men and boys shot down into mass graves, evoking visions of World War II concentration camps. And endless lines of refugees marching toward a future of despair. When I took office, some were urging immediate intervention in the conflict. I decided that American ground troops should not fight a war in Bosnia because the United States could not force peace on Bosnia's warring ethnic groups, the Serbs, Croats, and Muslims. Instead, America has worked with our European allies in searching for peace, stopping the war from spreading, and easing the suffering of the Bosnian people. We imposed tough economic sanctions on Serbia. We used our air power to conduct the longest humanitarian airlift in history and to enforce a no-fly zone that took the war out of the skies. We helped to make peace between two of the three warring parties, the Muslims and the Croats. But as the months of war turned into years, it became clear that Europe alone could not end the conflict. This summer, Bosnian Serb shelling once again turned Bosnia's playgrounds and marketplaces into killing fields. In response, the United States led NATO's heavy and continuous airstrikes, many of them flown by skilled and brave American pilots. Those airstrikes, together with the renewed determination of our European partners and the Bosnian and Croat gains on the battlefield, convinced the Serbs finally to start thinking about making peace. At the same time, the United States initiated an intensive diplomatic effort that forged a Bosnia-wired ceasefire and got the parties to agree to the basic principles of peace. 3 dedicated American diplomats, Bob Fraser, Joe Cruzel, and Nelson Drew, lost their lives in that effort. Tonight we remember their sacrifice and that of their families, and we will never forget their exceptional service to our nation. Finally, just 3 weeks ago, the Muslims, Croats, and Serbs came to Dayton, Ohio, in America's heartland, to negotiate a settlement. There, exhausted by war, they made a commitment to peace. They agreed to put down their guns, to preserve Bosnia as a single state, to investigate and prosecute war criminals, to protect the human rights of all citizens, to try to build a peaceful, democratic future. And they ask for America's help as they implement this peace agreement. America has a responsibility to answer that request, to help to turn this moment of hope into an enduring reality. To do that, troops from our country and around the world would go into Bosnia to give them the confidence and support they need to implement their peace plan. I refuse to send American troops to fight a war in Bosnia, but I believe we must help to secure the Bosnian peace. I want you to know tonight what is at stake, exactly what our troops will be asked to accomplish, and why we must carry out our responsibility to help implement the peace agreement. Implementing the agreement in Bosnia can end the terrible suffering of the people, the warfare, the mass executions, the ethnic cleansing, the campaigns of rape and terror. Let us never forget, 250,000 men, women, and children have been shelled, shot, and tortured to death. 2 million people, half of the population, were forced from their homes and into a miserable life as refugees. And these faceless numbers hide millions of real personal tragedies. For each of the war's victims was a mother or daughter, a father or son, a brother or sister. Now the war is over. American leadership created the chance to build a peace and stop the suffering. Securing peace in Bosnia will also help to build a free and stable Europe. Bosnia lies at the very heart of Europe, next door to many of its fragile new democracies and some of our closest allies. Generations of Americans have understood that Europe's freedom and Europe's stability is vital to our own national security. That's why we fought 2 wars in Europe. That's why we launched the Marshall Plan to restore Europe. That's why we created NATO and waged the Cold War. And that's why we must help the nations of Europe to end their worst nightmare since World War II, now. The only force capable of getting this job done is NATO, the powerful military alliance of democracies that has guaranteed our security for half a century now. And as NATO's leader and the primary broker of the peace agreement, the United States must be an essential part of the mission. If we're not there, NATO will not be there. The peace will collapse, the war will reignite, the slaughter of innocents will begin again. A conflict that already has claimed so many victims could spread like poison throughout the region, eat away at Europe's stability, and erode our partnership with our European allies. And America's commitment to leadership will be questioned if we refuse to participate in implementing a peace agreement we brokered right here in the United States, especially since the presidents of Bosnia, Croatia, and Serbia all asked us to participate and all pledged their best efforts to the security of our troops. When America's partnerships are weak and our leadership is in doubt, it undermines our ability to secure our interests and to convince others to work with us. If we do maintain our partnerships and our leadership, we need not act alone. As we saw in the Gulf War and in Haiti, many other nations who share our goals will also share our burdens. But when America does not lead, the consequences can be very grave, not only for others, but eventually for us as well. As I speak to you, NATO is completing its planning for I-4, an international force for peace in Bosnia of about 60,000 troops. Already, more than 25 other nations, including our major NATO allies, have pledged to take part. They will contribute about 2/3 of the total implementation force, some 40,000 troops. The United States would contribute the rest, about 20,000 soldiers. Later this week, the final NATO plan will be submitted to me for review and approval. Let me make clear what I expect it to include and what it must include for me to give final approval to the participation of our armed forces. First, the mission will be precisely defined with clear, realistic goals that can be achieved in a definite period of time. Our troops will make sure that each side withdraws its forces behind the front lines and keeps them there. They will maintain the ceasefire to prevent the war from accidentally starting again. These efforts, in turn, will help to create a secure environment so that the people of Bosnia can return to their homes, vote in free elections, and begin to rebuild their lives. Our Joint Chiefs of Staff have concluded that this mission should and will take about 1 year. Second, the risks to our troops will be minimized. American troops will take their orders from the American general who commands NATO. They will be heavily armed and thoroughly trained. By making an overwhelming show of force, they will lessen the need to use force. But unlike the UN forces, they will have the authority to respond immediately and the training and equipment to respond with overwhelming force to any threat to their own safety or any violations of the military provisions of the peace agreement. If the NATO plan meets with my approval, I will immediately send it to Congress and request its support. I will also authorize the participation of a small number of American troops in a NATO advance mission that will lay the groundwork for I-4, starting sometime next week. They will establish headquarters and set up the sophisticated communication systems that must be in place before NATO can send in its troops, tanks, and trucks to Bosnia. The implementation force itself would begin deploying in Bosnia in the days following the formal signature of the peace agreement in mid-December. The international community will help to implement arms control provisions of the agreement so that future hostilities are less likely and armaments are limited, while the world community, the United States and others, will also make sure that the Bosnian Federation has the means to defend itself once I-4 withdraws. I-4 will not be a part of this effort. Civilian agencies from around the world will begin a separate program of humanitarian relief and reconstruction, principally paid for by our European allies and other interested countries. This effort is also absolutely essential to making the peace endure. It will bring the people of Bosnia the food, shelter, clothing, and medicine so many have been denied for so long. It will help them to rebuild their roads and schools, their power plants and hospitals, their factories and shops. It will reunite children with their parents and families with their homes. It will allow the Bosnians freely to choose their own leaders. It will give all the people of Bosnia a much greater stake in peace than war, so that peace takes on a life and a logic of its own. In Bosnia, we can and will succeed because our mission is clear and limited, and our troops are strong and very well prepared. But my fellow Americans, no deployment of American troops is risk-free, and this one may well involve casualties. There may be accidents in the field or incidents with people who have not given up their hatred. I will take every measure possible to minimize these risks, but we must be prepared for that possibility. As President, my most difficult duty is to put the men and women who volunteer to serve our nation in harm's way when our interests and values demand it. I assume full responsibility for any harm that may come to them. But anyone contemplating any action that would endanger our troops should know this. America protects its own. Anyone who takes on our troops will suffer the consequences. We will fight fire with fire, and then some. After so much bloodshed and loss, after so many outrageous acts of inhuman brutality, it will take an extraordinary effort of will for the people of Bosnia to pull themselves from their past and start building a future of peace. But with our leadership and the commitment of our allies, the people of Bosnia can have the chance to decide their future in peace. They have a chance to remind the world that just a few short years ago, the mosques and churches of Sarajevo were a shining symbol of multi-ethnic tolerance, that Bosnia once found unity in its diversity. Indeed, the cemetery in the center of the city was just a few short years ago the magnificent stadium which hosted the Olympics, our universal symbol of peace and harmony. Bosnia can be that kind of place again. We must not turn our backs on Bosnia now. And so I ask all Americans, and I ask every member of Congress, Democrat and Republican alike, to make the choice for peace. In the choice between peace and war, America must choose peace. My fellow Americans, I ask you to think just for a moment about this century that is drawing to close and the new one that will soon begin. Because previous generations of Americans stood up for freedom, and because we continue to do so, the American people are more secure and more prosperous. And all around the world, more people than ever before live in freedom. More people than ever before are treated with dignity. More people than ever before can hope to build a better life. That is what America's leadership is all about. We know that these are the blessings of freedom, and America has always been freedom's greatest champion. If we continue to do everything we can to share these blessings with people around the world, if we continue to be leaders for peace, then the next century can be the greatest time our nation has ever known. A few weeks ago, I was privileged to spend some time with His Holiness Pope John Paul II when he came to America. At the very end of our meeting, the Pope looked at me and said, "I have lived through most of this century. I remember that it began with a war in Sarajevo. Mr. President, you must not let it end with a war in Sarajevo." In Bosnia, this terrible war has challenged our interests and troubled our souls. Thankfully, we can do something about it. I say again, our mission will be clear, limited, and achievable. The people of Bosnia, our NATO allies, and people all around the world are now looking to America for leadership. So let us lead. That is our responsibility as Americans. Good night, and God bless America.
President Clinton live from the Oval Office at the White House. Now, how will the President's address go over in the Republican-controlled Congress? Joining us from his office on Capitol Hill now, the Majority Leader of the United States Senate, Republican Bob Dole of Kansas. Senator Dole, thanks for being with us. You've heard what the President had to say. Are you now prepared to support him?
Well, I think the President took the first step. It was a good statement. We're going to be under the command of an American general. That's going to be very helpful. He didn't mention the United Nations. But what the President didn't talk about was the failure to do anything for 30 months while this ethnic cleansing was going on, and the fact that we tried and tried and tried in a bipartisan way to lift the arms embargo so the Bosnians could defend themselves. Had we done that, now that may be history, but had we done that, he wouldn't be addressing the American people tonight about it sending 20,000 American troops.
This is not going to come as a surprise to you that the Democrats, including those at the White House, will take part of that as a shot at them. Would you agree or disagree in your criticism about not doing anything, that there wasn't much done during the previous presidency? Which
in fact, I've said so. That's right. I've said so even started in the Bush administration. Candidate Clinton said if he were elected, he would have airstrikes and lift the embargo. We talked about that at the White House. But again, I'm just laying the premise. I think the President made a good statement. It is a terrible tragedy that's happened. There are women and children dying. But I think to be very honest with the American people, and that's how he's going to get support, we have to recognize that maybe the White House made mistakes or the administration made mistakes.
Senator Dole, what started out to be a skeptical U.S. military now takes the official position that the mission can be undertaken because all of the military's conditions have been met. Now, if the military has had its conditions met, what is it going to take to get your support for the President?
Well, I obviously want to support the President. I talked to the President yesterday. He called me from Camp David. I have a strong belief in the power of the President, the constitutional authority the President of the United States has and must have. And no doubt about it, whether Congress agrees or not, troops will go to Bosnia. So those are facts. We need to find some way to be able to support the President, and I think we need to wait and see what the American reaction is. I told him very honestly, I said, Mr. President, if you can't persuade the American people, I don't believe you'd be able to persuade the Congress of the United States, because this is an easy no vote. This is an easy political vote. Generally on the other side, Republicans now will look back and see what Democrats did in the Gulf crisis, when not a single member of the Democratic leadership in the House or the Senate would support President Bush. Now, I don't think it ought to be that way. We only have one president at a time. President Clinton is the commander-in-chief, and when he makes a case, as he started to make tonight, if he makes that complete case, then he should have our support.
Senator Dole, you are a deeply wounded war hero yourself with ground combat experience. Briefly, what do you believe will be the greatest danger to U.S. forces in Bosnia?
I think the greatest danger is, I think we need to find a way to arm and train the Bosnians, because if we're going to depart there in 6 months or a year, they've got to be able to defend themselves. And we can't have this so-called build down where the Serbs still are in a stronger position than the Croats and the Muslims combined. In addition, this needs to be a peacekeeping mission, not a peace enforcing mission. That's the concern of a lot of Americans. But on the other hand, keep everything in perspective. This is a volunteer force. When they volunteer for the Army, they understand there are certain risks involved. And I think most Americans will accept the responsibility. Certainly we're going to support the troops. They're going to be good young American men and women in some cases. They're going to have our full support once they're there.
Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's go now to CBS News correspondent, our national security correspondent, David Martin. David, what is the timetable for all this happening?
Well, you know, Dan, there already are small numbers of American soldiers in Bosnia in the form of survey teams sent in to check out the roads and runways. Then next week, a so-called enabling force of about 2,600 NATO troops, about half of them American, would go into Bosnia and Croatia to set up the communications and logistics needed to handle the much larger force that would go in once a treaty is officially signed in mid-December. And at the same time, the American 1st Armored Division would begin moving from its bases in Germany down to forward staging areas in Hungary, about 200 miles north of Bosnia. Then once the treaty is signed, the 1st Armored Division and the rest of this 60,000-man NATO force would begin moving into Bosnia literally within a matter of hours to set up this 4-kilometer wide zone of separation with the Bosnian Serbs on one side and the Muslims and Croats on the other side. And under the terms of the treaty, the warring parties have 30 days in which to pull their troops out of this zone of separation, or as the treaty puts it, be subject to military action. After that, the U.S. and other NATO troops would police this separation zone under rules that would allow them to use force against any threat either to themselves or to the ceasefire. Dan?
David, when I was in Bosnia, I know, and I have no reluctance to confess it, I was scared to death of mines. There are literally many tens of thousands of mines in Bosnia. Will that be the greatest on-the-ground threat to our troops when they first come in?
Well, I think if you were rating the hazards, the first would be the weather, snow and ice, which could cause accidents. Second would be the mines. There are an estimated 6 million mines in Bosnia, of which only 1 million are actually charted. And then I think the third threat would be the chance that renegade military units from either side who would not accept the peace treaty would launch attacks against the American or other NATO troops in hopes of undermining the peace treaty.
David Martin, live at the Pentagon. There'll be more on President Clinton's plan to send about 20,000 U.S. troops to Bosnia on your late local news, and of course on the CBS News overnight broadcast Up to the Minute. Harry Smith and Paula Zahn will have a full report tomorrow on CBS This Morning, and of course we'll have a lot of analysis, background, and context of this on tomorrow night's CBS Evening News. For now, Dan Rather, CBS News, good night.